Hi, I'm Marc Lamont Hill, and welcome to this special edition of UpFront, where we take a closer look at the plight of migrants and refugees around the world. Coming up, is the U.S. Remain in Mexico policy sending some migrants back to their deaths? And while the word refugee may evoke images of people fleeing war-torn nations, many are forced from their homes because of the increasing impact of climate change. Just months ago, Poland was refusing to allow refugees from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa into the country. Instead, they were met with tear gas, barbed wire, and were stranded in freezing conditions on the border with Belarus. Last December, I challenged Poland's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs on his country's refugee policies.
We are protecting the border of the European Union. Of course, those migrants who are invited by the Lukashenko regime to come to Belarus, they do have an option, of course, to cross the border if they do that through the crossing points with the legal documents. If without visa or without any permission to get to the European Union, it shouldn't be they shouldn't be allowed to cross illegally this border. So those who really want to go to the EU, what they need to do is to get the document, get the visa, or if they're asylum seekers, to apply in a special procedure to get that. So there are legal ways to get to the EU.
These people are coming to the border. They are asylum seekers, and they are literally being turned back. They're being denied access to even to the proper paperwork for asylum seeking, according to reports on the ground. How is this not a contravention of international law?
Well, maybe first we need to understand the nature of this operation at the Polish-Belarusian border. Those migrants are invited by the Lukashenko regime, by the leader of the Belarusian state de facto, invited those people, promising them that they will be smuggled to the European Union and using them as an instrument in his political operation against the EU. EU sanctioned Mr. Lukashenko, does not acknowledge him as the leader of the country. So this is a kind of revenge where the people are fully instrumentalized and used as somehow pawns or bullets in his hybrid operation. So we should not accept the fact that Lukashenko is blackmailing us with that kind of situation. But we want to help, of course, those who are already in this dire situation. That's why we try to send several humanitarian convoys. We try to get engaged international organizations in order to help them. IOM,
you say that,
Organization
sir, you say that you're trying to help people. Right now, at least 15 people have died. Many people say that they've come to the border and been turned away. For example, a 35-year-old man from the Democratic Republic of Congo traveled with his wife and 3 children, all of whom were under 7 years old. And he said that his family was pushed back twice by Polish border guards. The second time, he pleaded for asylum. And they wouldn't listen. He said they told him there's no asylum, there's nothing, go back where you came from. It's hard to hear those type of stories. How do you respond?
I do respond in such a manner that accepting those thousands or hundreds of people, unfortunately, we could encourage others to be in this difficult situation, because it is a way of doing money for Lukashenko as well. Inviting people, then encouraging them to cross illegally the border without securing or protecting the border. There will be even more thousands or tens of thousands of possible migrants. But we cannot accept all the people who just want to cross the border with an excuse as asylum seekers, because in the vast majority, unfortunately, those people are not asylum seekers, just regular migrants who, as they say, they just want to go to other countries.
On what basis do you say that they're not really asylum seekers?
Because the vast majority of those who already crossed successfully the border refuse to fill any documents claiming that they want to get to Germany and to get the asylum in other countries, Germany or or the Netherlands, not in Poland. Poland, for them, is just a transit country. According to the international law, the first safe country should be the place where they apply for asylum. And in this case, basically, it should be Belarus, because Belarus, for them, is the country where they decide to go.
You mentioned international law, which is interesting, because the 1951 Convention on Status of Refugees says that the contracting states, those who are signatories to this, shall not expel a refugee lawfully in their territory save on grounds of national security or public order. The expulsion of such a refugee shall be only in pursuance of a decision reached in accordance with due process of law. What's happening at the border is not due process of law. These people are being pushed away without due process. They're not being taken through an asylum process. They're often being denied even access to paperwork to engage in the process. So even if you're correct that these people ultimately don't want asylum in Poland, who are we to know without going through the process? This is clearly against international law. How do you reconcile your position with Poland's commitment to honoring international law, ostensibly?
First, this convention was signed in 1951. I think this phenomenon of weaponization of migration is relatively new, and this is the case which was not foreseen in this convention. The first thing. The second argument is that, of course, the pushbacks are not allowed when you are pushing back someone to the territory she or he is fleeing from. I mean, in this case, those people are, by their decision, going to Belarus. Nobody forces them to get on board to go to Belarus. For them, as I can imagine, Belarus is not a dangerous country. Of course, Belarusian regime is very dangerous for the Belarusian opposition or the political activists, but not for those people. It's up to them whether they want to decide to go to this country or not.
That was Polish Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcin GHEDINI-WILLIAMS, justifying his country's decision not to allow asylum seekers from Middle East, Asia, and African countries to cross the border from Belarus. But a few months later, Poland's doors were thrown wide open to more than 2 million people fleeing Ukraine, creating a railway link to make it easier for Ukrainian asylum seekers to reach Poland. So will Russia's war on Ukraine change the way Europe treats all refugees from now on? And what's behind this sudden shift to open borders? Recently, I put those questions to officials from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and Doctors Without Borders.
I think one thing that is critical here, and there's nothing positive that's coming out of this war, but I think one thing that we are focusing on is that this is an opportunity to shift this narrative, to say that that if shared, the responsibility of welcoming and supporting refugees is manageable. We are able to do this. European countries and international community overall is able to do this. The other thing that I've seen here, and I was at the railway station today here in Budapest, and I saw 2 trains arrive filled with refugees from Ukraine. And many of them were actually third country nationals. So a lot of students from Africa. I spoke to several from Tanzania, from Congo, and from Ethiopia. They also were saying, look, right now, Ukraine is our home. We were, one of them was just about 6 months away from graduating. So they're really unsure whether or not they want to try to wait and see if they can go back and finish their studies. And I think what we've seen in Hungary is that they're saying anyone coming from Ukraine right now, we consider a refugee, and they're being treated exactly the same, which, as you say, is something that we welcome.
Chana, there are many Africans and South Asians currently living in Ukraine who have faced significant delays or even been completely blocked from leaving the country. For example, a Nigerian national and father of 3 said he and his family were asked to give up their seats on a cross-border bus out of Ukraine, with Ukrainian military officers saying, "No blacks allowed." Can you speak about what black and brown residents are facing when they try to flee this war?
I think in terms of UNHCR's position, we've made it very clear there can be no discrimination based on nationality, ethnicity, or race. People that are fleeing from Ukraine, regardless of their nationality or background, are fleeing the same conflict, and they deserve the same right to access asylum and to have safety. That said, in terms of what's happening inside Ukraine, it's very difficult for us to assess. We have, like you, heard these incidents, seen these reports, and we followed up both inside Ukraine and in the neighboring countries to work with the governments to make sure that these are not policies and that they are not going to be replicated. And so far, we do have assurances on both sides that anyone who is trying to escape the war in Ukraine will be allowed to do so and will have safety and asylum on the other side.
Kate, is Doctors Without Borders doing anything to help these racialized refugees?
So for us, we treat people regardless of their race, ethnicity or background. But what we're seeing more broadly in Ukraine itself is a difficulty for population as a whole to flee, particularly from areas in the east where cities are becoming besieged and populations are struggling to move out. And for us, in terms of the services that are being provided in the countries surrounding Ukraine, these populations can be some of the most vulnerable, and we're trying as hard as we can to follow and to look into this because it's extremely difficult at the moment, though, to track what happens to people once they cross the border. They are spending 1-2 days in reception centres before moving on. So this it's early days.
Kate, is there any need for a more targeted response? It seems that the UNHCR and Doctors Without Borders has effectively taken a colorblind approach, saying, whoever you are, if you're in need, we're going to help. But if there is a disproportionate number of racialized people being mistreated, being pushed off of buses, being denied access to refuge, might there be a need for these organizations to actually overcorrect for that by targeting these racialized groups?
No, indeed. So when we look at populations in a context, what we are looking at is what services are being provided and who are the most vulnerable. And we are in a similar position to China and UNHCR in a way that whilst we hear many of these reports and we hear it in the news, in terms of what our teams are able to see right now, we're not actually able to see a systematic case of discrimination. However, given that it is so widely reported, it is one of the things that we're looking at doing in terms of supporting, because then that becomes an extremely marginalised population without the same access to the system that others have.
China, we've also seen the media, including an Al Jazeera presenter, come under fire for the way that they have described Ukrainian refugees compared to other asylum seekers. Some of the worst examples include reporters and commentators saying things like Ukraine, unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, is civilized, and that Ukrainians have blue eyes and blonde hair. How do these dehumanizing descriptions affect how people not just view, but ultimately treat asylum seekers?
Absolutely. I'm actually glad you brought that up, Mark, because I think the way that we talk about refugees in general across media it's become such a negative thing. Refugee has become such a negative word. And yet I think maybe the one thing that we're learning in this crisis is that absolutely anybody can become a refugee. And I have to say, one of the journalists that I spoke to recently said a similar thing. And I did ask him, so are you saying that if a refugee who looks like me or who looks like somebody from Africa, are you saying that this is different? And I think it's important that all of us actually face this.
That was a conversation with Chena Williams and Kate White on the double standards we're seeing play out in Europe's treatment of migrants and refugees. Across the Atlantic, another migrant crisis is unfolding on Mexico's northern border. Under former President Donald Trump, the U.S. instituted a so-called Remain in Mexico policy, forcing those seeking asylum to wait in Mexico while their claims were processed in the U.S. Despite protests from human rights organizations, a court decision forced the Biden administration to reinstate the policy while it seeks an appeal to end it once and for all. On a recent episode of UpFront, I asked our guests whether resuming the Remain in Mexico policy would lead to abuses, including killings, torture, and rape, as predicted by some organizations.
We've already seen it. Marco has interviewed people on the border when it was implemented during the Trump administration. I've been up there and talked to people in Tijuana, in Matamoros, in Ciudad Juarez. We know this happens. There's over 600 documented cases of people who came back who were assaulted or raped. In Mexico, there are people who have gone back to their home countries and been assassinated because that's why they left in the first place. They knew they were going to be assassinated. And nobody seems to want to take responsibility for what happens to those people. Mexico never had to accept that program. It's a violation of sovereignty because they're sending people who have legal processes in the United States back to Mexico, which Mexico has no responsibility whatsoever to accept these people. You know, they're shuttling them all over the country with no real plan of what they can do to have a livelihood, to survive, to have a future, because these policies are completely shutting them out.
Marco, the majority of asylum seekers crossing the U.S. southern border are coming from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. You were just in Honduras, in fact. What's your take on why people risk their lives to make this incredibly dangerous journey to the U.S. from places like Honduras?
Nobody migrates because they want to, because, you know, for pleasure. I mean, Central American countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras are plagued with U.S. guns, with organized crime, with corruption. And not only that, but Guatemala and El Salvador are, for example, among the 15 countries in the world most exposed to disasters. In November 2020, in Guatemala, and Honduras, and Nicaragua were amongst the countries to be most severely impacted by hurricanes Eta and Iota. In Guatemala alone, 40% of subsistence agriculture was affected, and 80% of basic staples like maize or beans were devastated. So these are countries that are under the terrible food insecurity already high from years before. So migrants are fleeing, you know, and like almost circumstances that are impossible to bear, like people cannot survive in their own countries. And that's why people embark in this, you know, almost impossible journey.
Laura, earlier this year, the Biden administration proposed a strategy to address the root causes of migration from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That included $4 billion in aid, U.S. aid to these countries. Is this any different from the programs we've heard in the past, seen in the past?
That's exactly the central point that follows up on what Marco was saying, because unfortunately it's not. And nobody, like Joe Biden, should know better than the fact that those kinds of proposals have failed in the past, because he was in charge of this, really in charge of Central American development and stabilization during the Obama administration. And what he did was impose the war on drugs model of putting the armed forces in the streets for public security tasks, impose a kind of an economic model based on foreign investment and the construction of these big mega projects that actually displace indigenous, especially indigenous and rural communities. And these end up being the people who migrate. And so to have a new four-year, $4 billion program that repeats those same errors is somewhat inconceivable.
Marco, how does security factor into dealing with the root causes of migration? The U.S. has spent $3.3 billion since 2007 assisting security forces with fighting criminal organizations and drug cartels in Mexico under what's known as the Merida Initiative. But since that time, 150,000 people have been killed due to organized criminal violence. It's a big number, more when you factor in disappearances and deaths of migrants. Where's the money actually going?
Well, these programs like the MEDECINS initiative and other similar programs that the U.S. has signed with Mexico and Central America have proven to fail because militarizing a country where there is no justice or access to justice or the rule of law, it's just creating much more inadequate conditions for the growth of violence. And so what we need to see, it's an agreement that not only includes economic investment, but a true commitment from the U.S. to control the flow of U.S. guns. We need the U.S. more invested in respecting the people's will when it comes to democratic elections and when it comes to, freedoms and rights for self-determination. So there's no investment in the economy or in security that it's going to be fruitful as long as the U.S. is not supporting and respecting what communities, what families in communities of origin are deciding for their own future, and as long as U.S. guns continue to flow and traffic it into their countries.
Laura CARLSEN, director of the Americas Program think tank, and Marco Castillo, co-executive director of international human rights organization Global Exchange. We've talked about those who flee their homes to escape violence, but what happens when the threat is due to climate change? Last November, we interviewed the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, to discuss how the world will respond to the growing number of people who are being forced from their homes due to extreme heat, wildfires, drought, floods, and other climate disasters.
The climate change, the climate emergency forces people to move. So there's an element of displacement, of forced displacement, that is linked in many, sometimes complex ways to the big climate change process that we are witnessing. Think of a big flood or a big drought even. Those phenomena which are increasing with climate change, they've always existed, but they're increasing, they're becoming more serious, more impactful with climate change. They force people to move, sometimes suddenly. But it's really the combination of factors that makes this phenomenon complex and of great relevance to my organization. Look, in many places, climate change is depleting resources, is taking resources away from very poor communities. And communities with less resources start fighting. This generates conflicts, which generate displacement of a type that is very, very germane to the work of my organization. These are fundamentally refugees that flee also because of climate change, but not only because of that.
One of the challenges is that there are no legal protections currently in place for people who are forced to leave their countries for climate change. That's because they don't fall under the definition of a refugee based on the UN's 1951 Convention on Refugees. Yet estimates state that there could be between 25 million to 1 billion environmental refugees by the year 2050. What is UNHCR doing to ensure that these people get rights and protections?
Well, the issue of definitions is very complicated, and we have to be careful in this world in which very often refugees are stigmatized. So I, as the head of an organization that is the custodian of the basic refugee protection principle, have to be careful. We wouldn't say, we don't use this definition that is sometimes used these days, climate refugees. But this is not to say that people that are moving because of climatic reasons do not have what we would call protection needs. Very similar to refugees. And sometimes, actually, they are refugees, as I said, because mixed with the causes of displacement is conflict, is discrimination, is persecution, and so forth.
Would they not experience greater protection, though, if they were considered to be climate refugees? Could you explain sort of why they're not and why they don't satisfy the conditions for being refugees simply based on being pushed out via the climate?
Look, it's also good when we talk about this to do a bit of a reality check. Most people displaced for climatic reasons are displaced actually within their countries. They're what we would call internally displaced people. Now, like I said, also, most of the people that flee across borders, there's other reasons that get in the mix. For example, war, conflict, intercommunal clashes. So we can consider them refugees in those cases, and all the protection applying to refugees apply in that sense.
That was Filippo Grandi of the UNHCR. Experts predict that by 2050, Hundreds of millions of people will be forced to migrate due to the effects of climate change. So is the world ready to cope with this challenge? That will be one of the many questions and issues up for discussion on our next season of UpFront. But for now, that's our show. UpFront will be back later this year.